All right, so then good night and welcome at the curatorial lecture of Cecilia Alemani. It's the first curatorial lecture of this year, and this is the fourth year that we have these lectures, which are an initiative of SMAC, the University of Ghent, and the Curatorial Studies at CASC. So after working with artists in 2017, learning from artists in 2018, and working with collections in 2019, working with space. Tonight's lecture and these lectures are online. This is decided when we made a program, and it turned out that we made a good decision. The other two lectures that are played in 2021, we plan them to have offline, so to have a physical lecture, and this will be a lecture by Karen Archie and Ippolita Postellini-Lappi. Let's see if we are good fortune tellers and these lectures can indeed take place physically. But about tonight's lecture, so Cecilia Alemani, she's an Italian curator based in New York, where she also studied at Arts. She's the artistic director of the Venice Biennale. It will take place in 2022, as you probably all know. Since 2011, showing works on the High Line in New York City. She did this together with her commitments as the artistic director of Art Basel Buenos Aires in 2018 and the creator of the Italian Pavilion in 2017 at the Venice Biennale. So she worked with public space and she showed numbers of works in I don't know if you can Venice, an unconventional place, but at least it's there's so the decision on the topic of tonight's lecture, art in unconventional spaces, and with this focus, I can say Alemani is probably the also for us, it's quite exciting to have more than 300 people joining this lecture. Maybe also the only benefit. So Cecilia Alemani will give her. You can write them down in the comment section of Zoom. Facebook, you can write them there in the comment section. Video, me will moderate these questions and ask them to Cecilia. So normally, if we were sitting here together, I would you to put your hands together for Cecilia. I don't know how we do this now, but please welcome Cecilia Alemani.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Godard. Can you hear me? Can you just give me a sign? Because Godard, you were breaking up a little bit, so I'm not sure if actually...
We hear you perfectly.
Okay, amazing. I couldn't hear much, so I hope you didn't say any mean thing about me, but thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited to be here. I wish I could see your faces, but I'm sorry that you have to see my big face on the screen, but I'm going to start soon a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm excited to be here and share with you some of my projects that in a way dealt with space, with unusual spaces. So before I do so, I just want to maybe start by telling you a little bit about myself and how I got here. As Godard was mentioning, I'm Italian. I was born in Milan and I grew up and studied in Milan. And then I decided, like many of you, to take the big leap and go to curatorial school many years ago. That was the early 2000s. And I moved to New York, where I attended Bard College, which at the time was one of the few curatorial schools around. And after I graduated in 2005, I decided to stay in the United States, stay in New York City. And I basically had my whole career here in the States, but I was able also to work a little bit with Italy and with Europe. So trying to keep both sides open. And I had maybe a less traditional career, meaning that as I graduated, I decided to work as a freelance curator, as an independent curator. Instead of affiliating myself with a museum or an institution, I try to keep many paths open and try to see different options and different platforms. So I collaborated with other curators on large exhibitions for which I was working as an assistant curator. I did my own projects, small projects in non-for-profit spaces, both in Europe and in America. I collaborated with art fairs, with Frieze and with Art Basel. I did shows in galleries and museums, but always trying to test the terrain and keep my options open. And then around 2011, so 9 years ago, I started working for the High Line in New York, which is my main job. Still now, it's my full-time job. And today, what I thought I would share with you are three projects. One of them is the High Line. I also want to talk to you about the Italian Pavilion that I curated in 2017 for the Venice Biennale. And then finally, if we have time, we can also talk a little bit about this sort of experimental project that we did in Buenos Aires in Argentina. The High Line and the Argentinian project are both public art projects. The Italian Pavilion is definitely not public art, but they're all connected by having exhibition spaces that are rather unusual. And in a way, you know, in my 20 years of career, I've never really worked in a traditional white cube museum. I always wanted to take the challenge of working with unusual spaces, being public spaces, industrial spaces, or unconventional spaces. So I have prepared it's a large presentation with lots of images. I might go through that rather quickly so that we can keep some good time for Q&A at the end. And yes, let me start by sharing my screen. So I hope you see it. So first I want to start by the High Line. So I hope you're all familiar with the High Line in your city, but if you're not, I'm going to give you a very, very brief history. The High Line is located in Manhattan, in the southwest side, where that little square is. And what the High Line is this very long suspended bridge that was used to carry freight train. In the 1930s, it was built in the 1930s, and the reason it was built elevated from the ground was in part because of this picture, because back in the early 1900s, the trains would run on the street level. And what happened is that they started killing a lot of people by running over them. And so the city hired these gentlemen on horseback that were called the West Side Cowboys. They would just ride in front of the train with a flag and making sure that people were not going to get killed, but that didn't really improve the situation. As a matter of fact, this was a picture of 9th Avenue, very close to the High Line. And as you can see, the congestion already at that time. So the city decided to elevate the train. Here you see the High Line probably in the 1940s or 50s. And as you can see, what was quite innovative of the High Line is that instead of being built on the avenue, which you see on the right-hand side of the picture, it was built in the middle of the block. And that was because this block, this area where the High Line runs till now, was an industrial district. It's called Chelsea. Now, of course, it's famous for its many galleries and museums, but back then it was mainly factories and storages and garage. So the High Line, which was a freight train, would carry the goods and the things directly into the factories. And here you see a clear picture of the train running through the building itself. And that was very innovative at the time. But this is what you could see from below. So what happened is that the High Line was used as a freight train for many decades, but then comes the 1960s, it was slowly abandoned because of the introduction of other means of transportations, mainly the trucking industry, which was cheaper than running trains. And so up to the 1980s, the Highland was completely abandoned. And the only thing that you could see when you were going also in the 1990s to Chelsea or to the west side was this uninterrupted bridge with this very iconic dark gray running above your head, but nobody really knew what was up there. And then in 1999, there was an article in the New York Times that said that Mayor Giuliani, the mayor at the time, wanted to tear the Highland down to make space for new real estate development. And at that point, two community members that lived in Chelsea and in the West Village, they both read this article. Here you see Robert and Josh. Those are the, and they decided to attend a community meeting to learn more about the Highland, because they both lived there. They saw this bridge and they didn't know what was up there, and they were curious to hear if there was a way of doing something up there. And that was their first encounter. Since then, they've been the co-founders of Friends of the Highland, which is a non-profit organization that was founded in 1999, and in 10 years managed to save the Highland from demolition and to turn it into a public space. I'm just fast forwarding because the story is very long, it's very rich, it's wonderful, but this was the Highland before opening to the public. So as you can see, it was basically a self-seeded garden that would just run through the city in the middle of commercial and residential buildings. And these are incredible pictures shot by Joel Sternfeld, who is a famous photographer who was hired at that point by Friends of the Highland to take these incredible pictures to convince the community and the city to save this incredible treasure. And so in 2009, the Highland opens. The Highland is important for people to understand, is a public park. So it's owned by the city of New York, but is operated and managed by Friends of the Highland, which is not a friends group, but it's a non-profit organization that basically manages the park on behalf of the city. Basically, we have a rent agreement with the city. We don't pay rent, but we raise money to maintain and operate the park. And so when the Highland opened in 2009, when we were doing studies about how many people would come, we were expecting about 300,000 people a year, because nobody was expecting the Highland to become a destination or a famous place. Now, well, not really now, but up to last year, the Highland would receive about 8 million visitors every year, which, as you can imagine, is much more than what was expected at the time of the construction. But since the very beginning, since 2009, the Highland wanted to bring art to the space. And that's in acknowledgement that some of the very early supporters of the Highland were the galleries that were in Chelsea, they're still in Chelsea, that wanted an amenity, wanted a green space in the neighborhood, but also public art. So in 2009, when the Highland opened, we decided, I wasn't working there, but the organization decided to launch an art program called Highland Art. And I've been responsible for the program since 2011. So this is my 9th season. And what we do, we basically commission and produce new artworks that you can encounter on the Highline or off the Highland, near the Highland, as you walk the park. The park is about 2.5 kilometers long and crosses 3 different neighborhoods now. You know, when I started working, I thought about, you know, I never actually done public art before, so it was an interesting and exciting platform for me to try something new. And I heard about the many challenges of doing public art and doing public art in such a popular space. But what was clear since the beginning is that we wanted to sort of diversify the idea of public art from being a traditional sculpture, like a bronze sculpture that ends up in your lawn, to opening up this notion of public art to include many other mediums and formats and forms of expression. So besides sculptures that, of course, we always love, we also have a video program. We have a number of billboards. We also commission murals and also performances, because in a way, the best part of the Highland is its people and its visitors. So we like to engage them in very dynamic performances that happen in the summer. But since we're talking about challenging exhibition spaces, I want to start, I selected a few examples of artworks that in a way talk about the complexities of doing art in public spaces. And the first one that I wanted to talk to you about is this incredible artwork by Ella Natsui, who I'm sure you know. This was my very kind of first monumental project that I did on the Highland, and it's not physically located on the Highland, but it's on a wall next to the Highland, because one of the things that we also attempt to do is to use the entire surrounding cityscape and surrounding city as a pedestal or as a canvas to hang artwork. So this was a quite challenging installation. As you can imagine, we had to hire a company that would install it from the building, from the rooftop, and it was made of a layer of glasses, of mirrors, and then as traditional kind of patchwork of metal plates that was installed and then kind of crumbled. But one of the main things that you hear, you know, that I heard when I started working for the Highland was that how everything had to be windproof. And by windproof, we meant that it need to be able to sustain hurricane winds. And I never really understood why, because you know, it's still New York City. And then, of course, when we were in the midst of installing this piece, Hurricane Sandy hit. And if you remember, that was 2012. And, you know, we were lucky that nothing happened to the piece, but it makes you realize how much more complicated it is to bring art of this scale in a very exposed space. I'm going to show you time-lapse video of the installation just to give you a sense of the scale, and very soon you'll see that there is a few seconds of gray. There you go. That was the hurricane, which, as you probably remember, was very damaging for the city. I remember walking in Chelsea the day after, and there was still water all the way like a meter high in the galleries, but luckily enough nothing happened to us or to the piece, but that made me realize how important, of course, that is, and working with engineer and architects to make sure that the piece can sustain such harsh weather. And I'm just going to show you some pictures of the same work throughout other seasons. As you can see, this is during the winter. Everything that we do on the Highland lasts for 12 months. So that's not just because it's great exposure for the artist, but because we like to sort of establish a dialogue also between the artwork and the surrounding nature, which of course changes dramatically throughout the season. And the Highland is open also in the evening, so the artworks completely change during the day. This is another project that we did, I would say 2013, so early on, and it's by the artist Carol Beauvais, who you might know for making these wonderful sculptures, very often using steel and heavy material, but being able to create very sensual forms. And I'm bringing this up because this is a section of the Highland that at the time was closed, was not renovated yet. And so what we did, we created an experience for visitors to walk in this side of the park that was completely closed and not restored yet, but art was the occasion of opening the door and to bring people in to see not just an incredible exhibition, but also a coexistence between the wilderness of the Highland and the art. Here you see some other shots. Installations are very often, people ask us, how do we install on the Highland? There is always or very often a crane involved, as you can see here. These were installed also in the midst of the winter, which, as you can imagine, also being so close to the river is quite harsh, and sometimes you can't use a crane because of the proximity of the to the trains. So we had to be creative in the ways that we brought art on the park on top of the on the train tracks. And so here you see this part of the Highland, which now I can't even look at these pictures because it's completely different. It's where currently there is this new development called Hudson Yards, but at the time it would just wrap around the trains. And so you have the river on one side, this very industrial pass on the other side. And so we really try to create a path and an exhibition and an art experience that would establish a dialogue with all the realities surrounding this space. And here you see the final exhibition through different seasons. So this is very early spring. And then you see that the vegetation starts growing quite exponentially. And everything that we do on the highland is in dialogue with nature. So there is no way that we remove plants or trees or weeds if there is an artwork. So the artworks and the nature surrounding needs to be interconnected, as you can see in this picture. And that's always, usually it's what artists appreciate and like about working on the highland, because there is this quite unique sense of belonging and rootedness to a landscape that has been there for many, many years. And remember, whatever you see here in terms of plants is all self-seeded and spontaneous vegetation. We don't, in this section of the highland, we don't plant anything, it's just wild. And so here you see people having to come in by groups because it wasn't open to the public, but they could have this experience, immersive experience of both architecture, the city, and art. And then, of course, he always knows. Great. I'm going to go a bit quickly. In the same section of the highland, the following year, when we were actually about to open to the public, we did another project that was challenging for other reasons. This was a project with the Argentinian artist Adrián Villarrojas, who is someone who I'm sure you have encountered before, who works with usually large-scale sculptural installations that often include quite unusual materials and ingredients like plants and meat and vegetables and stuff like that. So here you see the same section now has a path that has been built. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that has been built to provide access to this space. And these cubes is Adrián's piece, which was called The Evolution of God, and were these 13 moments, like sculptures that changed throughout time. And I wanted to show you the sort of behind the scene of this project, because it was a really complicated one to realize. While the Carole Bouvet was in the midst of the winter, this project was installed in the midst of the summer. So it was extremely hot. And as if you have walked the highland, you know that there is not really a lot of shade. So we created this sort of portable tents. And the idea of the project was to create these cubes that would contain a wide array of organic material, like seeds and fruits and vegetables and clothes. So here you see the preparation of some of these shapes that then would appear and would reveal themselves in the sculpture itself. So of course, watermelon, discarded fruits and veggies that we would gather from the neighborhood, because remember, in a way, this was also a sort of homage to the history of the highland as a freight train. They used to carry mainly meat and other foodstuff. So we went kind of local and shopped for lots of different things. And then everything would end up in this sort of cubes. Here is me on the right cleaning some oyster shell that the artist wanted to include, and all other kinds of root vegetables, cement, soil, and clay were the main ingredients that were mixed. And as you can see here, bones to sort of pay tribute to the meatpacking district, which is not far from the highline. And then they basically cured for 2 months. So everything was installed in July, it was packed in layers inside, and then opened in September, just in tandem with the opening of this section of the highland. And so this is a project that for me is always very instructive, especially for young curators, as we try to reconciliate the idea that you want to plan everything ahead of time and you want to know exactly what the results will be, with a flexibility of not knowing what result you will get out of an artistic process. So in this case, the idea was that the cube itself would generate life and would sprout and would break open, would create life, and then eventually would die. So here you see different stages of the same project in different time of the season. So at some point, this whole piece collapsed on the ground. Here you see different layers of history and consumption. And so it's, I could talk for many hours about this project because it was extremely complex in terms of permit and preparation, but sometimes when you do projects like this in the public space, there is a little bit more flexibility I found than working in a white cube space or in a museum space, because you're allowed to be a bit more experimental. It's we don't have registers on the Highline, and so we're also able to sort of work with the artists to make sure that we can realize these kind of wild projects. We had beans, and then of course the snow again. And then we had to dismantle them, and this is a good example of something that couldn't be saved, but we had to toss it. Although I still find some pieces on the Highline, some remains. This is a project that we did with Olafur Eliasson, thinking about a completely different project. It was called the Collectivity Project, and it was a participatory project that consisted of over 2 million pieces of Lego that were left on tables, and people could come and do whatever they wanted, but the prompt was to build their own ideal city. And the location where this project happened was very close to this new real estate development that is called Hudson Yards. So in a way, we invited the community and the local inhabitants to come and create a model of what they would like to see around them instead or in addition to what was already there. And this is another kind of challenging project. As you can imagine, we had, I don't remember how many hundreds of thousands of people that came to play with this, but it was quite complicated to maintain. But it's one of those projects that we still hear people after 5 years asking, where is the Lego project? We love this so much. Why don't you bring it back? Because in a way, I think it brought a sense of not just playfulness, but also an access to imagination and openness that very often public art doesn't really allow you for. And here you see some other shots. Very popular piece. It was really popular also among praying mantis. And then just to conclude the Highline, this is the most recent project that we launched last year. Here you see the model of a sculpture called Brick House by American artist Simone Lee. And this is quite the opposite of what I've just showed you, which were a number of more experimental projects. And in a way, this is quite at the opposite side. It's a more traditional bronze figurative sculptures, but one that we decided to choose to inaugurate a new platform for art on the Highline, which is called the Highline Plinth. So here you're looking at what we call the Highline. The spur is one of these sort of dead end that shoots off the Highland up at Hudson Yards at 30th Street and cross over 10th Avenue. And it's the most recent space that we opened on the Highland last year. And what's special about this space, it's a large square, like almost a piazza. And maybe being European and really missing also the idea of the piazza as a gathering space, as a space where the community comes together, which is really not part of the urban structure of American cities. We wanted to do very little in terms of design up on the spur and to have a central artwork, which we install on top of a plinth, of a pedestal, and offer sittings around and enough space for people to gather, to come together, and to use art as a springboard for conversations and discussions about some of today's important themes. So Brick House, which is this sculpture, is the inaugural project, but for the Highland Plinth, we're following a sort of different curatorial format. And here you see these stunning views of the sculpture in dialogue with the city around. And so what we did, we invited 80 artists to submit proposals for the next splint, which will happen in the future. And here you see, I know it's small, but here, and you can see all of this on the Highland website. There are about 80 proposals that engage with the site of the Highland and its surrounding in different ways. And so the next phase of this, we will select 12 shortlisted artists that will be able to create a small sculptural maquette, or like a figurative maquette that will be exhibited on the Highline, so that people can really understand what the final sculpture would look like if selected, and then we'll select the finalists, which will be in the future years. And this was a very exciting project for us, because usually the art program is fully curated by myself and the curatorial team, but this we kind of open up a little bit the process to invite proposals from artists from all over the world. And let me take just a sip of water. So the other project that I wanted to talk to you about is the Italian Pavilion in Venice that I curated, the National Pavilion that I curated in 2017. I was selected to curate the pavilion, which is located, for those of you who are familiar with the Biennale, which is located at the very end of the Arsenale. Well, you see a big white arrow. These two kind of buildings are, half of them are the Italian Pavilion. The Italian Pavilion has a long story. It's been here, to make it short, it's been here since 2007. And it's now the biggest, and here is the entrance to the National Pavilion. It's now the biggest national pavilion in Venice. It used to be a coal storage facility. So it's this giant space of two sides. And, you know, when I was asked to submit a proposal, it was a very complicated space, because it's extremely daunting and monumental and has a 15 meters tall ceiling. And what I wanted to do is to make sure that the architecture of the space itself could actually shine and could be visible and in dialogue with the artworks. In previous editions, I felt there was almost an attempt to fight the architecture and neutralize the architecture with white walls or like a number of partitions. I thought it wasn't necessarily the most successful approach to this space, which is really, really dominating. So I decided instead to embrace the space and to basically not build any partition and let the artists kind of handle the space. And so the exhibition was titled, here you see sort of the map. Here, the exhibition was titled Il Mondo Magico, and brought together the work of three artists, Italian artists, Giorgio Andreotta Calò, Roberto Cuoghi, and Adelita Husni-Bey. And the theme of the show was taken, the title of the show was taken by a book by an Italian anthropologist called Ernesto De Martino, who spent many, many years studying the rituals and the magical rituals of Italy's south, especially after the Second World War, and looking at the idea of magic, not just as a sort of esoteric tool, but as a epistemological tool to know the world and to accept different histories that are not necessarily the most traditional ones. And so I wanted to use the metaphor of the magic as a way of interpreting the work of these three artists. Roberto Cuoghi is an artist based in Milan, and he had the entire first navy of the space. And what he decided to do was transform this space into a factory that would produce sculptures from the beginning to the end, both of the making of the object and of the exhibition. So since the beginning of the exhibition, he created on the left side here, sort of a workshop area where his studio and his team would make sculptures on a daily basis, especially in the beginning, but then on a weekly basis, they were on site. And the idea of the piece of the project was called The Imitation of Christ, which is the title that comes from a medieval book about spirituality. And the idea that Roberto had was to question the figure of the iconography of the Christ and basically produce a number of sculptures that, while the mold of the sculpture would be the same, the inside would change every time. So during the exhibition, the team and the artists produced, I don't know, many dozens of sculptures that were very special because they were made of organic materials. And so as you can see in this kind of pipe going into the sculpture, the recipe is still quite secret, but it was based of, there was some gelatin and some agar mixed with organic materials and seeds and other things that we never knew what they were. But the idea here, you see the artist opening up the sculpture, and here is what the sculpture would look like out of the mold, but then it would enter this sort of labyrinth of cells, which reminds very much something that we are very used to see right now, but not back then. And each of these cells or igloo had a different temperature and degree of humidity. So the sculptures themselves would change dramatically in the duration of the exhibition. So basically, after they were made in the workshop, they entered these spaces and they were like quarantined in different atmospheric conditions, and they would start growing mold and crack and get covered with other forms of life. And if you're familiar with his work, he's very interested in the notion of metamorphosis and trying to and questioning the identity of the human body. And here you see very much what happens to his sculptures during the exhibition. I wish I could explain the sense of smell and olfactory sense that was also quite strong and present as you entered. You could enter these cells, and at the end of this tube or this tunnel, you would find yourself in the third part of the exhibition, and each of the sculptures would enter this machine. There was a deep freeze machine that would suck out the humidity from the bodies, and then basically turn them into actual sculpture that would not deteriorate or change at all anymore. So in this third phase, then the artist would start hanging the final sculptures, so the same object, but in the final stage on the wall. And at the end of the exhibition, the wall became much more populated. So as you can imagine, also for an Italian, this was quite an extreme project, but one that was, I think, really meaningful for many people. And, it's, as with the Adrian Villarojas project, every time you work with organic materials or materials that change, is always quite complicated. And I'm sure there are people that have done that in museums, but at least I hope, working in less traditional institutions like the Venice Biennale allowed me and the artists to be experimental and to really try new technique and be, in a way, kind of less strict with what you can do or you cannot do in a space. Of course, I'm also simplifying it. It was really complicated. We had to add a ventilation system because people started fainting. But I think it was worth the effort. And so this was the first navy, and then entering the second one was divided in two artists. One was Adelita Husni-Bey, who's a young artist from Italy, and hers was a more traditional video installation, but one that really highlighted the space. Again, she didn't want to build any wall whatsoever, but created just this very mesmerizing, full immersive video installation in which, in the video in which she invited a group of young kids from New York to participate in workshops in which they were talking about issues of environment and politics, prompted by the reading of a number of tarot cards, almost like in a spiritual sessions. And then you would enter the third part of the pavilion, which was the work by Giorgio Andreotta Calò, who completely transformed the space in a really radical way. So you would enter and you would find yourself into this sort of forest of scaffolding poles, in a way evoking also on one side the architecture of a church, but on the other side, what was important for the artist was also to reference the sort of temporary scaffolding that gets installed, especially at the time where in L'Aquila there was a big earthquake. And so the artist was very interested in referencing that. And the space was extremely dark. There was no artificial light whatsoever. And you would walk and your eyes would get adjusted. And then you would see there was a spot of light near the window where he installed these beautiful shells that were made of bronze, and sort of started to think about a more aquatic or marine environment. For those of you who aren't familiar with the artist, he's someone that has worked a lot with water, both thinking of water as a creative force, but also a destructive one. He's an artist from Venice, so as you can imagine, water is something that is very dear to him, and especially the lagoon environment around Venice. And then at the end of this sort of forest of scaffolding poles, you would see a staircase, and as you walk up, you would turn around and see this image, which was basically a vast pool of water, but it looked just like mirror. And what it did, it created this doubling effect between underneath and above, and mimicked and doubled completely the architecture of the pavilion, creating this incredibly strong, mesmerizing, and also confusing image. Many people did not realize it was actually water. They thought it was a mirror or it was metal, but it was just a few inches of water that were poured in this giant pool that Giorgio basically built on a scaffold. And it was almost like a mirage. You would see yourself reflected, but that also it was so dark that you couldn't really see much. And as you sat there for a few minutes at the end of the installation, you would start recognizing some forms and actually realizing that perpendicular to the water, there was a mirror installed at the end. So you would see yourself reflected in that mirror, but it took some time for your eyes to adjust. And I think here in this photo, you can see these are just the people reflected in the mirror at the end of the space. And as you can imagine, or maybe you can't, but this was one of the most complex installations that we've ever realized. I actually have to give credit to the artist and his team, because they got it completely under control. But I want to share this time lapse with you because it took more than 2 months to prep the space and to realize this kind of incredible piece, architectural project. So here you see them painting the wood that goes under the pool. I'm going to fast forward the time lapse 1 second. So here you see the bottom of the pool, the waterproof material. Now the water pipes are coming in because, as you can imagine, the water had to be changed on a regular basis because otherwise it would start stagnating and smelling. So we had a whole hydraulic pumping system that would take the water in and out. This is the mirror that was installed. There was just basically a film, like a membrane, that is often used in art installation, but it was kind of impressive to see how it completely changed the space. This was a curtain that divided actually the space from the video installation. And now you're going to see the water coming in and just stay like that. Great. So I think we have just a few minutes because I think it's be great to open up. I'm just going to show you really quickly this other project because, again, talking about unusual spaces and unconventional exhibition spaces, this is a project that I did together with Art Basel in 2018 in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And so it was the first project of a series of a new kind of hybrid model that the fair Art Basel launched in 2017, which was the idea of collaborating with cities around the world that were not necessarily let's say on the art map, but wanted to because of different reasons. And the idea of, instead of creating a commercial event like an art fair, what if they were able to create the same sort of results in terms of you know, visitorships and cultural production without bringing the fair. And of course, if you're familiar with what happened in Miami is, and of course in Basel, in other cities, the idea that the city itself around the fair, around these cultural institutions, really functions in a synergetic way. And so all the galleries and museums open at the same time, and they bring on exhibitions to coincide with this event and to really think of the city itself as an ecological art system. And so the first attempt to do that was in Buenos Aires, which is a wonderful city that has an incredible art history and art presence between galleries and museums and fantastic artists that live there. But the only thing that is maybe a bit penalizing them is the fact of being quite far away from any other art center in the world. So the city of Buenos Aires approached Art Basel with the idea of doing this first Art Basel Cities project. And I was selected to be the artistic director there, and I was responsible for an exhibition that took place in the city of Buenos Aires. And I'm showing you this picture, which was one of the most iconic projects, which is actually still, I think it's still on view. This is a Barbara Kruger piece, and it's painted on an abandoned silos for grains that you see back here. This is in a new section of the city called Puerto Madero, which recently has been sort of the target of a new way of approaching also urbanism. And so the names of the streets have been changed to honor female and women in the history of the city. And the bridge itself, which is built by Calatrava, is called Puente delle Mujeres, or the women's bridge. So there is this tradition of respecting and paying homage to Argentinian women, and Barbara wanted to do one of her iconic pieces, which says, can we live without, and it says power, pleasure, property, equality, empathy. And so this was one of the projects that I curated, and it was part of this large exhibition in the public space, which was called Hopscotch. Hopscotch is the title of a famous book by Julio Cortázar, famous Argentinian writer, that has a very experimental structure. So you can both read it, let's say, in a linear way from chapter 1 to chapter to the final chapter, or you can jump from one chapter to the other, like hopscotching your way through the book itself. And I like that kind of metaphor of hopscotching through different locations in the city of Buenos Aires. And also hopscotch is, of course, a famous children's game that is very well known in different cultures, and it's kind of an ancient name. And so when I was invited to do this project, I wanted to really focus on an area of the city that hasn't seen much public art. I think, you know, Buenos Aires is an incredible city when it comes to culture and literature and arts in general, but in terms of public art, the city hadn't seen much experimentation out there. And so what we did, we selected an area, basically a belt along the Rio de la Plata, which is the main river there. And in a way, funny, like weirdly enough, unlike many cities that really use the waterfront to expand its construction in the city, Buenos Aires is kind of built inwards. Le Corbusier famously visited the city in the 1920s and said that Buenos Aires gives its back to the river, and that's very true still now. There isn't much built along the river. It's still quite wild and actually wonderful. So the show took place in different locations along the river. This is an incredible planetary built in the 60s, where we reinstalled Stan van der Beek 1960s piece with like over 27 projections, and it was accessible only at night because the artists had envisioned it to kind of stimulate dreams. This is the house of Victoria Ocampo, who was an important intellectual, female intellectual of especially in the 1920s and 30s, and we invited Ad Minoliti to bring her colorful installation and at the same time conduct a seminar on feminism. This is a piece by Alex da Corte, who brought one of these inflatable sculptures that I usually use in New York at the Macy's Thanksgiving parade, and it's Kermit the Frog in this very industrial space, which is closer to La Boca, which is another very fascinating neighborhood in Buenos Aires. This was it was a power plant, and so in the control room, we invited Alexandra Pirici to stage her performative installation called Aggregate that you see here. We had performances by Eduardo Navarro in the Botanical Garden. Gabriel Chaile, a local artist, did this oven made of adobe where he would cook also empanadas every day. Luciana Lamotte, like a more traditional sculpture in a park. Mariela Scafati in an incredible space. This was Maurizio Cattelan's project that was a sort of a cemetery for the living. It was a participatory project where artists and people in Buenos Aires were invited to bring a tombstone of their creation of a person that was still alive. Mika Rottenberg, I apologize, this picture is terrible, but this was one of the most fascinating venues that we found, and was a museum. It's called Corcova, and it's a museum of copies of famous European sculptures, not just European, actually, also from other cultures. We invited a young artist from Argentina called Santiago de Paoli to constellate the space with these lovely paintings and installations. This is Vivian Suter, who also is originally from, or lived in, actually she was born in Argentina, and she often exhibits her canvases in between spaces, atriums or patios like this case. And these canvases are made outdoors as well with the use of nature. This is the inside of the same building where Pia Camille brought one of her t-shirt curtains that was then the backdrop for lots of performances and other activities. And this is a very iconic brutalist library, the public library, where Leandro Katz did one of his lunar alphabet pieces. This is actually a piece that is permanently installed there, and it's a gift to the city. It's been donated to the city, but also the space itself was activated by a fan performance by David Horowitz. And then finally, this was my favorite piece. We found this incredible bridge that would project out in the Rio de la Plata that was is still used for fishermen to fish. We invited Eduardo Basualdo, who is a young artist from Argentina, to create a very subtle poetic installation at the end. But to me, it was a metaphor of really how art can help you look at the city from a completely different perspective, or your own city from a different perspective. And in this case, you had this very powerful views on the city of Buenos Aires. And what he did at the end of the pier, as you walked for like over a kilometer, you would find yourself at the end of the pier, and he removed the sort of parapet and installed instead a revolving door with the same colors of the Argentinian flag. And I think I'm going to stop here because I think I probably bore you very much. So I think we can probably get some questions.
Yes, we have already quite some questions. But first, thank you, Cecilia. I think it was really very interesting and very inspiring to listen to you and hear all these great projects.
Thank you.
We have quite some questions, so I think we have to make a bit of a selection. But I think this is also quite, like I see quite some interesting questions, and maybe some questions we can combine.
Sure.
I will start with a question by Tanya Boon. She asks, how do you deal with the heterogeneity of the public when you work in public space? Does it affect the curatorial approach? What is, in that sense, the difference between the High Line and the Venice Pavilion, for example?
I think that's an excellent question that comes very natural as you start thinking of public art. And it's a question that I ask myself all the time. And especially when I started working at the High Line, I was really conflicted between trying to be popular but not being populistic, because somehow you assume that of the 8 million people that really visit the park, probably 0.1% is like art lovers or art expert. Everybody else is like regular people, tourists, and with not necessarily a large knowledge of art. But I think, you know, I stopped thinking that that was a challenge, and I kind of embraced it as a way of bringing a diverse program. So, you know, I think at the beginning, I was more concerned about bringing something that was maybe considered a bit more conceptual, but then in the end, I actually realized that by just observing how people behave on the High Line and walk, they all get its art. And to me, the most rewarding aspect of my job is to sit on a bench on the High Line and just listen at people's comment in all different languages, and they all get its art. Maybe they don't get that that's a reference to something that the artist had specifically in mind, but I think in the end, I want to work with artists that understand the beauty of bringing their work to such a wide audience and are able to create artworks that offer different entry points and different encounters. You know, I saw people shouting at pieces of art on the High Line. They were so upset about them. So, but that's okay too. I think as long as you can engage with the public and have a wide array of reaction and interaction, that's when I think I would say a successful artwork in the public spaces. I think when it comes to Venice, it's slightly different, just because Venice is a less, I mean, of course, you need, first of all, you need a ticket. So I think people that come and are able to spend $20 to come in are more aware they're going to have an art experience, unlike the High Line, where they usually come and they don't even know there is art. But at the same time, I think that's, for me in Venice, especially when it comes to the pavilion, I think the strength is really the dialogue and the juxtaposition between the main show and the pavilions themselves, because they really create a sort of such a large variety of experiences. And I think that's the beauty of it, that you sit next to a pavilion that offers a completely different experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a question that quite elaborates on a bit on this is a question from Eduardo de Mayo. He's asking more about the places you are exhibiting. So he's asking what strategies should a curator implement to install contemporary works in a historic center in order to create a conversation between modernity and the antiquity. So he's more asking about exhibiting contemporary art in a historical place or in a more contemporary place as the High Line. Like, how do you be aware of space, really?
Yeah, to me, it's I think the High Line is a good example, and the project in Buenos Aires is sort of the opposite. The challenge of the High Line is that it changes every year. You know, I worked there for 9 years, and I can't believe when I look at pictures of 9 years ago how different everything was around it. and especially where I showed you the picture of the brick house of Simone Lee's piece, which is a very northern section of the highland. The highland itself is a relic. It's a piece of archaeology. It was built almost 100 years ago, and then, of course, for American standards, but then surrounding it is just super brand new buildings and skyscrapers that have nothing to do with the highland. And so I think, to me, what I try to do is be true to the highland itself and look outside, but also letting the artists decide whether they want to create a dialogue with the surroundings or not. And I think Brick House is an excellent example of a sculpture that talks about everything but what's around her. It's a sculpture that talks about Black femininity, identity, and everything around it is a very masculine, very heavy, quite sexualized landscape. And I think she managed to be true to her vision without necessarily responding to that. But I think as a viewer, you can draw parallels and a dialogue between the two. In Buenos Aires, it was the opposite, because we really occupied and took over spaces that have been there for many, many years. But it was, I think, in the dialogue between what the artist brought to those spaces and those spaces, that was where the magic happened, because it was really an exhibition that was targeted to the local audience and to the people that lived there, who were invited to go to places they'd never been to. I heard so many people telling me that they've never been to that museum of the fake sculptures. And through art, they were able to see their own city and their own institutions and building from a different perspective. And then, the show leaves, and hopefully somebody else will do other projects there.
Yeah, I think a question that also that you maybe already answered a little bit is, and there are two questions that I think can be combined. Is the question: is the site your starting point that you respond to? And I think it's nice to also the question of Ewa, who asked which criteria or principles do you give to the artist when it comes to briefing a site-specific work for the Highland?
Yeah, first question, I very much like to start from the site. That's the way, maybe because I've never really been trained to do a show in a white cube space, which is always kind of the same. I always love to start from the site. And so for instance, for the Highline, the first thing that we do with an artist is a site visit, is a walk. And so we walk the park, and the only thing I say is, maybe just talking about what's not a possibility because of different restrictions, but really trying to give carte blanche to the artist to come up with also spaces that I never thought of. I don't have a list of spaces artists can use. I want to actually hear from them, because usually it's actually through their eyes that the most surprising discoveries, also in terms of spaces, come up. And can you just remind me the second question?
Yeah, the second question was, what do you ask artists when you invite them, like to do a site-specific work? And which criteria or principles do you give them?
Yeah, I think, again, it's I try to be present and helpful, but at the same time supportive and detached, meaning I'm there to serve the artists and to help them. So of course, especially when it comes to the Highland, there are plenty of restrictions. I started the talk by telling you about the wind restriction. Everything needs to be hurricane proof, which is actually very true. And so I think the hardest part for artists working on the Highland is to understand the impact of people, and that's the main difference with a museum, in which in theory you expect that people don't really touch or do anything to your work, although it's not necessarily true. But on the Highland, there is no way we can say, for instance, don't touch or don't climb. Everything that is out there needs to be absolutely able to take on the touch of 8 million people, because I can tell you that 8 million people are going to touch that piece. So there are a number of restrictions that are very pragmatic and practical. But what we try to do with my team is to we produce these new works. So it's not that just we go to the studio, we see something that we like and we bring it, but all the artists are given a budget, but not only a budget to make a new work, but really helping them, sharing our expertise to do art in the public space, because it's complicated and many artists don't necessarily see all the different factors in it. But so that's what we try to do as an institution that commissions new work. We try to support artists also by sharing our knowledge and know-how, and then putting them in touch with fabricators and really brainstorm with them everything that could possibly happen to a sculpture. But it's always like that. Every time we install then a sculpture, something happened that we did not think of. But that's, I think it's also trying to communicate that, unlike in a museum, I think, or a gallery, once the artwork is in the public space, that's where it is. It belongs there. It belongs to the public space, and you had to kind of let go. You had to let it go. And yes, there might be something that will happen that was not what you envisioned, but I think that's also the beauty of working in the public space. I remember once we did a project with Virginia Overton, which was basically a sculpture in the shape of a truck, like a real truck, a ready-made truck, that was parked in one of these parking lots that goes up and down next to the High Line, and the bed of the truck was completely full with bricks, like a wall. And it was one of these objects that you don't really know what you're looking at. Is it a sculpture? Is it an artwork? Is it just a truck, like a weird truck? And we thought about everything that could happen, and nobody thought that people would start throwing coins at it because they thought it was a wishing well, or like a fountain where you throw coins and make a wish. And that was, totally okay. Of course, we would take care of cleaning it from time to time, but it was one of those things that you would have never thought of, but the artist also embraced.
Yeah, great. There is a beautiful question by Samuel Salamakers. He's asking if you can say something about the afterlife of these site-specific works. Mm-hmm. The High Line does not acquire these works on view, if I'm right. Are any works permanent? And maybe Melissa West, she's asking about any insight into the budget for these great projects. But mm-hmm. I think maybe it's more interesting because in the beginning you mentioned the Chelsea area and the big galleries who are there, in which way they relate, for example, to these projects.
Okay, so first, afterlife, everything that we produce goes back to the artists. They own the piece. They can do whatever they want. They can throw it in the river. They can sell it. They can just keep it in the studio. It's theirs. We have nothing to do with that afterwards. Question about budget. We try to produce everything that you see on the High Line. What I thought was really exciting and surprising is that we managed to do a lot with not a lot of money. We are resourceful, and I was saying that what we're proud of is to really share our expertise and really try to make the works ourselves with the artists, because we learn how to be resourceful, and eventually we managed to create some of these artworks for not a huge amount of work. Of course, I showed you, I have to warn you, I did show you the biggest pieces, but sometimes we can create a sculpture, our budget for piece goes between $10,000 and $100,000, except the plinth itself, like Brick House, of course, that's another level because it's a much bigger project. But when it comes to the sculpture that you encounter along the path, that's a range, and it's not a lot of money, but we're able to actually do a lot. And then what was the question about the galleries?
No, I was wondering, because in the beginning you were talking about, because it's in the Chelsea area, and you were pointing out very briefly the galleries who are also interested in having public art. So I was wondering, how are they involved in this project? Or
they're really not involved. It's to me, it's important that we recognize that we are in the art district, and I think that's important because you should understand also that the High Line is not necessarily an art institution. The art department is one of many departments. So for most of the world, the High Line is a botanical garden. So people go see plants, don't necessarily go see art. But and so that's why I'm saying it's important to recognize that we are in the art district, because we have the Whitney, the shed, the galleries, the kitchen. And so I often have to remind my colleagues and the organization in general that we need to talk to them as well, because they are our near neighbors. And so when I said one of the reasons we brought the art program on the Highland is because of the galleries, because galleries moved from Soho to Chelsea in the late 1980s, and so there were the very few businesses that were there. Back then, Chelsea, I mean, still now now there are lots of real estate development, but back then it was kind of a no man's zone, and so galleries were kind of the only business, and so they were very supportive of the efforts of the Friends of the Highland to open this park, because they saw the possibility of this incredible park and an amenity. Now galleries, I talk to them often. Of course, I look at the program, but we try not to, not necessarily to overlap. So if a gallery calls me up and say, hey, I have this great sculpture, do you want to put it on the Highland? We kindly say no, because we try to have a separate program. But of course, they are part of the community, and it's very important that we keep in touch and we create, ideally, we want to make sure that people that go to Chelsea to see galleries then come on the Highland, and vice versa. So we always try to include them in our communication, but being very mindful of the sort of commercial risks of showcasing art from those galleries.
We have a lot of questions, but we can't do them all, I think. So just tell me when you have enough of it, then we stop with the questions.
Okay.
But there is a question by Flor Maase. He has two questions, actually. He's asking if you knew Roberto Cuoghi personally, and how was it to work with him? And his second question is, where do you want to see the creation and role of art going towards, and what role do you want to play in the future as a curator?
So yes, I knew Roberto Cuoghi before. I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever really worked with him on a large scale project, but he's, I would say, one of the most well-known Italian artists. And I think his vision and research really fit with my idea of sort of surveying the role of magic in our production. So it was a sort of kind of clear match, and it's been wonderful to work with him, although, the project was quite complicated. But maybe that leads to the next question. I think I always thought of myself as a facilitator, not as a curator author. I think I want to be there to support the artists and their really fantastic visions and projects. And so I hope, it's hard to forecast what's going to happen in the world tomorrow, or in a couple of years. But I think I want to hope that curators can also be, what's in between the artists and institutions, and really someone that can also facilitate the artist's life by taking care of a whole set of boring admin and bureaucratic practices and procedures that the artist should know how to handle, but shouldn't handle necessarily, because that kind of takes away. And that includes fundraising, includes all the technical engineering stuff.
So maybe one question to end with, I think, is a question by Koi Persijn. He's asking, can you elaborate on the motivations for raising an open call for the plinth? How was this communicating, and is this an ongoing methodology? And many thanks for the very inspiring lecture.
Thank you. So the plinth itself is not officially an open call. I'm sorry if I misspoke, but so normally the art program is completely curated by myself and by my team, meaning that we approach the artists, we ask for proposals and stuff like that. For the plinth itself, which I also have to credit, when we were thinking about the plinth, we completely stole the format of the fourth plinth in London, which is one of the most successful, in my opinion, public art projects in the world. And it's so great that we just basically kind of stole what they do, and not just in terms of the plinth, but that's what they do. So what we have done is we engage a number of what we call advisors that are curators, museum directors, artists from all over the world, especially from areas where we don't necessarily have an expertise or contacts with. And we ask them to suggest up to 5 artists that they think could take on the challenge of creating such a monumental sculpture. And when I say monumental, I don't necessarily believe public art needs to be monumental, but in that specific spot, because there is so much competition with the surroundings and because the view from the avenue is so important, there needs to be something that can hold onto the space. And so then we approached these artists, and this year we had about 80 artists, 80, and we asked them to submit a proposal, which in the beginning is just a digital rendering. We pay them a fee to submit a proposal. We gather all the information, and this year, unlike the previous iteration, we also post them all on the website so that people could actually leave feedback and input. It wasn't a voting system. We did not ask people to vote, but it was nice to receive, I think we got more than 5,000 comments. And it's not just, oh, I like it, I don't like it, but some of them were actually really thoughtful, and especially those coming from people that live around the area that help us really understand or think about something that we were not thinking of. And then out of these 80 proposals, we select 12. We just selected them. We will be announcing them in the next few weeks. And these artists are the shortlisted artists, and we commissioned them to create a sculptural maquette, or like a little sculpture that then is exhibited on the High Line. And again, people can leave comments, but it's really more to transition from a digital render into a sculpture. That's always, to me, it's the most fascinating phase of also commissioning public art, is when you gotta get real and you need to make sure that your beautiful drawing is actually realizable and feasible and can sustain, 120 miles per hour wind and many other atmospheric impact. And so as they move from the digital render into the sculpture, they fine-tune the fabrication process, and then we exhibit these 12 maquettes, and then finally we choose 2 out of these. So this is a very long process, and we do that just because it's a larger project on the High Line and it's on a different timeline. Everything else on the High Line is on a 12-month cycle, basically a year cycle. This is a year and a half, just because just to produce a sculpture that scale usually takes about a year.
Yes, so then the motivations for an open call is really this long-term project.
Yeah, it's the scale, it's the long term, and it's also for us is also a way of learning, and it's hard for a curator to say, try to relinquish your curatorial voice and to give and leave space for other voices to arise, but it is also very much selfishly a learning opportunity. And many of these projects that we don't necessarily select for the plinth because we don't think are the strongest, or but we do realize them for other locations on the High Line because we believe in them and they're beautiful, but maybe they don't need to be on the plinth itself, which is in a way on its own cycle. So it's also for us to kind of broaden our knowledge.
And maybe a really final last questions, because we have a lot of questions about the Venice Biennial, and we already said it's not possible to talk about it. But I will maybe try, because I see some possibilities that maybe things you can answer.
Sure.
For example, I will combine 2 questions by Nathalie Zonneberg and Samuel Salamakers. And the questions are, how does it, that you already, your experience with the Italian Pavilion, does it affect what you will do there in 2022, the directorship? Mm-hmm. And the question by Samuel that I think adds really nice to this, will there be specific public art commissions? So without talking about artists, maybe these are things we can...
Yeah, I mean, the first question, yes, of course, I feel lucky that I already worked in Venice, and I know, first of all, the organization, which is also like a very complex machine. It's good to know it in advance. They are just amazing, and they can realize incredible exhibitions. So I'm excited to working with them again, because the Italian Pavilion, unlike all the other national pavilions, is paid by the minister, but it's produced, basically fabricated by the Venice Biennale. So I got to know the team, which is fantastic. So I look forward to working with them. And yes, I think it's not easier. It's probably more complicated, but it's good that I met them. And in a way, the space is not the same, but there is something about the space of the Arsenale, which is fairly similar to the Italian Pavilion. The Italian Pavilion doesn't have columns, which helps a lot, I find. But there is a sense of scale and monumentality and just the history of that space that I feel lucky to have learned about and to have used. It's hard to imagine what my show will be like because it's a completely different scale and it's a different number of artists. So the approach might be similar, might be different, but yes, I think I'm glad that I actually got to use part of those spaces already. And in terms of public art, there are some spaces within the Arsenale that are outside, like the Giardino delle Vergini and behind the Italian Pavilion, actually, that are part of the main international exhibition that I oversee. Those spaces recently, I want to say maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, have become public. So you don't have to have a ticket to enter or to access them. So I will definitely use them. I don't know with what, but they're part of the exhibition. And so it's exciting to be able to also offer a little bit of the exhibition also to everyone that actually strolls around that part of Venice.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we're all very much looking forward to see what you will do. And I think also
me too.
we look forward to celebrate the opening again in 2022.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, let's hope so.
But thank you very much. And, it's good luck with this funny year, but we'll get through it.
With Bennett and all the other activities in the High Line.
Thank you. Come visit. And if you ever come to New York, let me know. I'll take you all for a walk.
Yes, be careful what you wish for because we will be there. Thank you very much, Cecilia.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye.